He believed he was about to put a nobody in her place, but what he didn't realize was that every word he spoke was quietly sealing his own downfall. Naomi Carter stepped out of the elevator and into the executive lounge on the 42nd floor, where glass walls framed the city skyline, and the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. Men in tailored suits paused mid-conversation. Women in designer dresses glanced over their champagne glasses. And in the middle of it all, Naomi stood in simple jeans and a fitted black shirt, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady, as if she belonged there more than anyone else. She moved forward without hesitation, heels clicking softly against the marble floor, heading toward the private conference room at the far end, but she didn't make it far. "Ma'am," a voice cut through the low hum of conversation, sharp and deliberate. "This area is restricted." Richard Whitmore stepped into her path, his silver hair perfectly combed, his navy suit pressed to perfection, his expression carrying the kind of confidence that came from years of being obeyed without question. He gave her a quick once-over, his gaze lingering just long enough to make his judgment clear, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Members only," he added, louder this time, just enough for the surrounding guests to hear, and a ripple of quiet amusement passed through the room. Naomi stopped, meeting his eyes without a hint of discomfort, her voice calm when she spoke. "I'm here for the meeting." For a fraction of a second, something unreadable flickered in her gaze, but Richard didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if indulging a child who didn't understand the rules. "I think you're confused," he replied, his tone smooth but edged with condescension. "People don't just walk into a place like this." The room grew quieter, conversations fading as attention shifted toward the unfolding scene, curiosity mixing with silent judgment. Naomi didn't move, didn't argue, didn't explain. She simply stood there, composed, as if the weight of every eye in the room meant nothing at all. And that calm, that silence, only made Richard more certain he was right. He straightened his cufflinks, stepping slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled, but not enough to hide the dismissal in it. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Richard Whitmore expected hesitation, maybe even an apology, the kind of quiet retreat he had seen countless times before, but Naomi Carter did not move, and that stillness began to shift something in the air, subtle at first, like a change in pressure before a storm. Around them, the soft clinking of glasses faded, conversations dissolved into murmurs, and more eyes turned toward the center of the room, drawn not by noise, but by the tension that now hung between them. Richard noticed it too, and instead of stepping back, he leaned further into it, his confidence sharpening into something colder. "I do not think you understand," he said, his voice now carrying across the lounge with deliberate clarity. "This is a private executive space. Our clients expect a certain standard." The word standard lingered, heavy with implication, and a few people nearby exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others quietly entertained. Naomi's expression did not change. Her eyes remained steady, her posture relaxed, as though his words had not landed the way he intended. That lack of reaction unsettled him more than any argument could have. He straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket, as if reclaiming control of a situation that, in his mind, should have already been resolved. "Security will escort you out," he added, this time without the pretense of politeness. A uniformed guard near the entrance hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward, his movements cautious, uncertain. Naomi finally shifted, but not in retreat. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the glass wall overlooking the city, as if taking in the view, then returned her gaze to Richard. "Is that really necessary?" she asked quietly. The question was simple, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that made the guard pause mid-step. Richard exhaled through his nose, a faint, impatient sound. "You are disrupting a professional environment," he replied, each word clipped, controlled. "Yes, it is necessary." The room had gone nearly silent now, the kind of silence that amplifies every small movement, every breath, every unspoken judgment. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, then slowly reached into her pocket. There was no rush in her motion, no sign of anxiety, only a deliberate calm that felt completely out of place in the tension surrounding her. She pulled out her phone, glanced at the screen, and pressed a single button. No explanation, no announcement. Just one call. And as the line began to connect, something invisible shifted again, something no one in the room could yet explain, but everyone could feel. The call did not last more than 2 seconds, and Naomi Carter did not say a single word before ending it, slipping her phone back into her pocket with the same quiet composure that had unsettled the room from the moment she arrived. Richard Whitmore let out a short, incredulous laugh, the kind meant to reassert control, but it sounded thinner now, less certain than before. "That is not going to help you," he said, folding his arms as if the matter was already decided. The security guard had stopped just a few feet away, unsure whether to continue, his eyes flicking between Richard's authority and Naomi's calm, searching for something that would tell him what he was supposed to do next. Around them, the silence deepened, no longer casual curiosity, but something heavier, more focused, as if the room itself was waiting for a cue it could not yet see. Naomi did not respond to Richard's comment. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the entrance, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as though she was measuring time in a way no one else could understand. 10 seconds passed, then 15. The tension stretched thin, almost uncomfortable, and a few guests shifted their weight, exchanging uncertain looks. Richard cleared his throat, his patience wearing thinner with each passing moment. "I am done with this," he said, sharper now, stepping slightly closer as if to force a conclusion. "You need to leave. Now." The words echoed more loudly than before, but this time, they did not land the same way. Because just as he finished speaking, the glass doors at the far end of the lounge opened with a quiet but unmistakable precision. Every head turned at once. A man in a dark charcoal suit stepped inside, his pace quick, his posture rigid with urgency, followed closely by 2 others who carried themselves with the unmistakable confidence of senior leadership. Conversations that had already faded now disappeared completely. The air shifted in an instant. The man's eyes scanned the room, bypassing Richard entirely before locking onto Naomi. And in that single moment, something changed so completely that even those who did not yet understand could feel it. Richard frowned, irritation flickering across his face as he turned to see what had drawn everyone's attention, still unaware that the next few seconds would unravel everything he thought he controlled. The moment the man in the charcoal suit locked eyes with Naomi Carter, his entire expression shifted from urgency to something far more controlled, almost deferential, and he quickened his pace without hesitation, his polished shoes echoing sharply against the marble floor as he crossed the room. The 2 executives behind him followed closely, their presence alone enough to signal authority, their faces tight with concern rather than curiosity. A hush fell so completely that even the faint hum of the city beyond the glass walls seemed to disappear. Richard Whitmore straightened instinctively, adjusting his posture as if preparing to greet someone important, his earlier irritation replaced by a practiced corporate smile. But that smile froze the instant the man walked past him without a glance. Not a nod, not a pause, not even acknowledgement. It was as if Richard did not exist. The man stopped directly in front of Naomi, his voice lower now, careful, almost measured. "Miss Carter, we have been trying to reach you," he said, each word precise, carrying just enough for those closest to hear. Naomi met his gaze calmly, as though this interruption was expected, as though the tension that had consumed the room moments ago had never touched her at all. "I was on my way," she replied simply. The man nodded quickly, a subtle sign of relief passing across his face. Behind him, one of the executives glanced toward the conference room, then back at Naomi, clearly waiting for her direction. The shift in power was immediate and undeniable, even before a single explanation was given. Guests who had been watching with quiet amusement now stood motionless, their expressions tightening as realization began to form, piece by piece, in the silence. Richard's smile faltered, confusion creeping into his features as he looked from Naomi to the man, then back again, searching for context that no longer fit the assumptions he had made just moments ago. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his voice no longer as steady as before, the authority he had relied on beginning to slip. The man in the charcoal suit turned slowly, his gaze landing on Richard for the first time, and in that brief glance there was no hostility, no raised voice, just a quiet recognition of a situation that had already gone too far. And in that stillness, with every eye fixed on Naomi, the truth was no longer something waiting to be revealed. It was already unfolding in front of them. Richard Whitmore felt the shift before he fully understood it, the kind of subtle but undeniable change that made the air feel heavier, as if the room itself had turned against him. The man in the charcoal suit held his gaze for a moment longer, then spoke with calm authority that did not need to be raised to be heard. "There is no issue," he said evenly, "unless there has been a misunderstanding involving Ms. Carter." The way he said her name was deliberate, precise, carrying a weight that rippled through the room like a quiet shockwave. Naomi Carter did not react to the attention, but the stillness around her seemed to deepen, as though every person present was recalibrating their perception in real time. Richard swallowed. The confidence that had once come so easily now caught somewhere between his chest and his voice. "I was simply enforcing policy," he replied, though the words sounded weaker now, less certain, as if even he could hear the gap between what he believed and what was unfolding. One of the executives behind the man stepped forward slightly, glancing at Naomi before addressing the room in a tone that was both respectful and unmistakably firm. "Ms. Carter is not only expected here," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "She is the one leading today's executive session." A ripple of realization moved through the crowd, quiet but electric, as heads turned back toward Naomi with entirely different expressions now. Curiosity replaced by recognition, amusement replaced by disbelief. Richard's face lost color, his mind racing to reconcile the image he had formed with the truth now standing in front of him. Naomi met his eyes again, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm that made the moment feel even sharper. She took a single step forward, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance completely. "I did say I was here for the meeting," she said softly, her voice carrying further than it should have in the silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the security guard had stepped back, his earlier uncertainty replaced by quiet understanding. Richard opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came, his authority dissolving in the face of something far more real than titles or assumptions. And in that still, echoing silence, the truth settled over the room in a way no explanation ever could. The silence did not break right away, and that was what made it unbearable, because in that stillness, every person in the room was forced to confront what they had just witnessed, not through explanation, but through realization. Naomi Carter did not raise her voice, did not demand attention, yet the entire room seemed to orbit around her presence now, as if the balance of power had quietly but completely shifted. Richard Whitmore stood frozen for a moment longer, his mind racing through every word he had spoken, every assumption he had made, each one now echoing back at him with a weight he could not ignore. He cleared his throat, attempting to recover some trace of control, but the gesture only highlighted the contrast between who he had been moments ago and who he was now in this room. "Ms. Carter," he began, his tone noticeably different, stripped of the earlier confidence. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding lingered, fragile, as though it might collapse under the truth surrounding it. Naomi studied him quietly, her expression unchanged, her posture still relaxed, but there was something sharper now beneath the calm, something that made it clear she had seen this moment long before it arrived. "A misunderstanding usually happens when someone is not given the chance to speak," she replied, her voice even, measured, carrying through the room without effort. No one interrupted. No one dared to. Richard nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if agreeing was the only safe option left. "Of course," he said, forcing a small, uneasy smile, "and I apologize if I acted too quickly." But even as the words left his mouth, they felt insufficient, not because they were wrong, but because they were late. Around them, the executives remained still, watching not just Naomi, but the entire interaction unfold with quiet attention. The man in the charcoal suit shifted slightly, waiting, not stepping in, allowing the moment to resolve itself on Naomi's terms. She glanced briefly toward the conference room, where the meeting was clearly meant to begin, then back at Richard. "Policies are important," she said calmly. But so is judgment. The sentence was simple, almost gentle, but it landed with a precision that no raised voice could match. Richard's expression tightened, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to defend. And as Naomi turned slightly toward the conference room, ready to move forward without making the moment any bigger than it needed to be, the room remained silent, not out of shock anymore, but out of respect that had finally replaced assumption. Naomi Carter did not rush as she turned toward the conference room, and that unhurried movement carried more authority than any command ever could, her heels echoing softly across the marble floor as the executives instinctively stepped aside to follow her lead. The man in the charcoal suit moved slightly ahead, opening the glass door with quiet respect, but he did not speak, as if even he understood that this moment belonged entirely to her. Behind them, the room remained frozen, guests still standing where they were, their earlier confidence replaced by a silence that felt heavier now, more reflective. Richard Whitmore did not move at first, his eyes fixed on Naomi's back as she walked away, each step widening the distance between who he believed she was and who she had just revealed herself to be. The reality settled in slowly, not as a shock, but as a realization that could not be undone. He had not simply misjudged a guest. He had misjudged the one person in the room whose presence defined the very space he had tried to control. A quiet murmur finally began to ripple through the crowd, not loud enough to break the atmosphere, but enough to signal that something fundamental had shifted. Naomi paused briefly at the doorway, not turning fully, but just enough for her voice to carry back into the room. "We are starting in 2 minutes," she said, calm and precise, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. It was not a reprimand. It was not a warning. It was simply a statement of fact, and yet it carried a weight that made everyone straighten, adjust, prepare. The executives followed her inside without hesitation, the door closing softly behind them, leaving the rest of the lounge in a quiet aftermath. Richard exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his reflection faintly visible in the glass wall beside him, no longer the commanding figure he had relied on, but someone forced to confront a different measure of himself. The security guard stepped back into position, avoiding eye contact, while a few guests exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. And as the room slowly began to move again, the silence that remained was not empty, but filled with a lesson no one there would forget. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere shifted from tension to precision the moment Naomi Carter took her seat at the head of the table, not because she announced authority, but because everyone present adjusted to it. Without being told, the glass walls framed the skyline, but no one was looking outside anymore. Every set of eyes was on her. Folders were opened, tablets lit up, and a quiet readiness settled across the room, as if they had all been waiting for this exact moment. Naomi did not rush. She placed her phone down beside her, glanced briefly at the agenda, and then began. "Let us start with the acquisition timeline," she said, her voice calm, clear, and deliberate. No hesitation, no filler, just direction. One of the senior executives began outlining projections, but halfway through, Naomi raised her hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to refine. "Those numbers assume a static market response," she said, her gaze steady. "But the data from last quarter suggests a 15% shift in consumer behavior. Adjust for that, and the margin changes." The room stilled for a fraction of a second before the executive nodded quickly, recalculating, the confidence in his earlier tone replaced by focused attention. Another executive attempted to pivot the discussion toward a safer, more conservative approach, but Naomi leaned forward slightly, her presence sharpening without ever becoming aggressive. "If we move cautiously now, we lose position," she said, her voice still even, "and the competitors we have already outpaced will recover. That is not a risk. That is a guarantee." No one challenged her. Not because they could not, but because every word she spoke carried the weight of someone who had already seen the outcome before the conversation began. The man in the charcoal suit exchanged a brief glance with another board member, both nodding almost imperceptibly, their earlier urgency replaced by quiet confidence in her leadership. Decisions that would normally take hours unfolded in minutes, not rushed, but precise, each point landing cleanly, each direction clear. By the time she closed the final document, The room was no longer just attentive. It was aligned. Naomi looked around the table once, her expression unchanged, but her presence unmistakable. "We move forward as discussed," she said simply. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Just silence. The kind of silence that only exists when everyone understands they have just witnessed something undeniable. The lounge did not return to its usual rhythm, even after the meeting concluded and conversation slowly resumed, because something unspoken had settled into the space, something that lingered in the way people now carried themselves, in the way their eyes moved more carefully, more thoughtfully. Naomi Carter walked through the room one final time, not seeking attention, not acknowledging the subtle shifts around her, yet every step she took seemed to draw a quiet awareness from those nearby. The same marble floor, the same skyline beyond the glass, the same polished atmosphere remained unchanged, but the perception of it had altered completely. Richard Whitmore remained near the edge of the room, no longer positioned at the center, his posture less rigid now, his expression more reflective than commanding. When Naomi approached, he straightened slightly, not out of habit, but out of something closer to respect, the kind that forms only after certainty has been replaced by understanding. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was honest, stripped of assumptions and pretense. Richard finally inclined his head, a small gesture, measured and sincere. "I misjudged the situation," he said quietly, each word chosen with care, not for effect, but because there was nothing else left to say. Naomi regarded him calmly, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. "It happens," she replied, her voice even, without edge or dismissal, but not without meaning. She paused for just a second, then added, "What matters is what you do after." The words were simple, almost understated, yet they carried a clarity that lingered longer than anything louder ever could. Around them, a few nearby guests lowered their voices, instinctively giving space to a moment they understood without fully hearing. Richard nodded again, slower this time, as if absorbing something that would stay with him far beyond this room. Naomi gave a slight nod in return, then turned toward the exit, her steps steady, unhurried, as she left the lounge behind her. The doors closed softly, but the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt earned. And in that quiet, the room held on to a lesson that needed no repetition, because from that day forward, no one there would look at quiet presence the same way again.